All right, this is Mr. Singleton, and today we're going to be looking at a lesson on arguments and backing those arguments up with evidence. Let's get started. If we look at this first image here, it's a picture of a textbook that's popularly used for this course. The name of this course is AP English Language and Composition. And I would say that this idea of everything being an argument is definitely going to be a theme for this course all year long. And it's a great way to think about everything we write and everything we read. We have to think of it as an argument. So I put a picture of this textbook that is actually designed for this course, and you can see it's the theme of that textbook as well here. Everything's an argument, and you'll notice there's some images on here of different things, and the claim is that all of these images are even arguments, right? Can tennis shoes be an argument? We're going to look at that today. So when we say argument, we're not talking about this kind of argument where two people are angry at each other and just shouting and that kind of thing. That's not the kind of argument we're talking about. We're really talking about argument as in trying to make a point or statement. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is everything you look at, every billboard advertisement, every song you listen to, every poster you see on a wall, everything is making a claim or trying to make a point or a statement about something. And we have to start thinking about everything we read and everything we look at as trying to make a claim or a point to us. For instance, the clothes we choose to wear make an argument, right? When we choose to wear a humorous t shirt, maybe our argument to people is that we have a sense of humor or we want you to think we're funny, right? When you choose to wear your Letterman jacket and it's got all the sports or all the activities you're involved in, you're trying to make an argument to people that, hey, I'm involved in this thing. This is a part of my identity. And for those of you who might be thinking that, oh, well, I don't have a style or I don't pick out the clothes I wear. Well, maybe the argument you're trying to make with your fashion is that you don't care. Maybe that's the argument you're trying to make. In any case, everything we choose to even wear on our bodies are an argument that we're trying to make many times. So it's important to understand that even though we think everything's an argument, we have to understand that there are good arguments and bad arguments. There are strong arguments and weak arguments, and there are true arguments and false arguments. One of the main ideas that I'm going to try to communicate to you today is that really good, strong, true arguments are arguments that are defended with strong evidence, and that's what we're going to get into today. So, why is it important to have evidence for any claim we're making? When we write anything like that, why is it important to back ourselves up with evidence? What kinds of things count as evidence? And how can I use evidence? These are the questions I'm going to try to answer today. And I wanted to start out, I know this is a strange image on the screen here. I want to start out and tell you a little bit about the O.J. Simpson trial. This is a really famous image of a really famous court trial that happened in the 90s. O.J. Simpson was a famous athlete, football player, and actor, and he was accused of murdering, which is kind of intense. He was accused of murdering his wife at the time. Um, and this trial was like one of the first trials to be nationally publicized like this on television, where the audience was looking every week. Americans were looking to see what was going on this trial. Everybody had an opinion. But this photo is of really the breaking point in the trial, right? The prosecution that was accusing OJ of these murders said, Your Honor, we have evidence that we'd like to submit. We have these bloody gloves, these blood-stained gloves that were found at the scene of the crime, and these are O.J. Simpson's glove. A pretty strong claim, right? O.J.'s defense attorneys very brilliantly said, well, hey, how can you prove? Do you have evidence to prove that those are O.J.'s glove? And the defense attorney said, famously, the quote is, "If the gloves don't fit, you must acquit." So on national TV, they actually had OJ try these gloves on, and the evidence worked in OJ's favor. The glove did not look like it fit. And sure enough, OJ was acquitted of all charges. He was found not guilty, and a lot of people point to this moment in the trial of the prosecution not having strong or good evidence, and the defense using that evidence against him as like this turning point in the trial. And this is how I want you to think about writing. Throughout the year, when we work on these papers, I'm going to be pushing you and reminding you to have strong evidence, to have more evidence. Many of you are used to writing a bunch of claims in your essay, and you never really back them up with strong evidence. And I want you to remember it this way: you have to bring the bloody glove into the courtroom. Can you imagine what would happen, for instance, in a trial like this one, if the prosecution were to say, Your Honor, we think OJ committed the crime, and we have these bloody gloves that are his gloves, and we think that'll prove it. And then the judge usually would say, okay, can you submit those into evidence? What would happen if the prosecution were to say, well, actually, Your Honor, we're not going to show you the evidence here today. We don't have the evidence with us. We don't have those gloves with us, but you just have to trust us, right? They'd be laughed out of the courtroom, right? You have to bring evidence into the courtroom. You have to back yourself up. They'd be laughed out of the courtroom. The same concept goes for your writing. Whenever I ask you to make a claim in your writing, whenever I ask you to respond to a prompt, the expectation is that you bring lots of evidence with you. And we're going to talk more about evidence, but I'm going to remind you sometimes in your writing to bring that bloody glove into the courtroom, which is kind of intense, but that's how we do it. So it's important to remember that a claim, or as we call it, an argument, is just a lonely statement hanging out there in the wind until it teams up with some good evidence and good reasons. So, how do you use evidence? Well, there's several ways in which you can use evidence. You could offer evidence that agrees with your stance up to a point, and then add to it with your own ideas, right? You could present evidence that contradicts or disagrees with your stance in order to argue against or refute it, and therefore that would strengthen your position, right? This would be like, well, some of my opponents say this, and that's true to a point, but here's where they're wrong, something like that. You can use sources, outside sources, against each other as if they're experts on a panel discussing your proposition. Particularly when we do the synthesis essay for the AP test, you're going to have to use outside sources. You can also use quotations to support your assertion, not merely to state or restate your claim, right? We're going to practice that with the synthesis essay as well. You'll pull quotations from other experts and use that to support your own ideas. That's probably the most common type of writing you'll do in college. In fact, the first type of advanced placement essay that we're going to work on will be the synthesis essay. And for the synthesis essay, they're actually going to give you several sources, and you're going to have to read through those sources and pick out a few quotes that maybe back up what you're trying to say. So for the first example on this PowerPoint, I'm going to show you how to use evidence that you would find from a source to back yourself up. So there's a way to use evidence that's very strong, and there's a way to use evidence that's weak. This is just a general guideline for how you can use evidence in a strong, effective way. In order to use evidence effectively, you need to integrate it smoothly into your paragraph by following this pattern. First, you would state your claim in a paragraph. You would say whatever statement you're trying to make, whatever reason you're giving in your argument. And then, second, you would give your evidence. You would actually tell the evidence, remembering to relate it to the claim. You would actually put that quote from the outside source into your paper at that point. And then this third part is the part a lot of students like to skip over, but it's probably one of the more important parts in bringing out your own voice in your own argument, and that is you have to comment on the evidence and have to connect it for your reader and show how it supports the claim. What does it mean to connect it for your reader? A lot of times when we write things, we write things for ourselves. We write things that are just in our head, things like that. I'm going to challenge you to think about writing differently in this class. I'm going to challenge you to think about writing as communicating with a specific audience. That anytime you write something in this class, you're also thinking about the audience that you're communicating to. Same thing when we read. When we read things in this class, it's really easy to read something and not think about the people who wrote it and what they were trying to do. One of the challenges of this course is that when we read things, we're actually going to be thinking, what choices did the author make? Why did they use these words instead of those words? And that kind of thing. So that's a very important portion of this. So I want to give you an example of a very weak, bare bones use of evidence using that pattern, right? It says, today we are too self centered. That would be the claim being made. Today we're too self centered. Most families no longer sit down to eat together, preferring instead to eat on the go while rushing to the next appointment. Gleich 148. Now you'll notice this here. This is what's called internal citation. There will be some other presentations where I go into detail about how you can do that. But what this tells you is that an author named Gleich on page 148 of their document actually said something to this effect. Now you notice this is not in quotations. That means it's not a direct quote. That means the author of this paragraph has paraphrased the idea that Gleich presented, but you still have to give him credit. So Gleich said, most families no longer sit down to eat together, preferring instead to eat on the go while rushing to the next appointment. Now, what you'll notice is that the last sentence, you're only given one sentence of commentary, and it's not very deep commentary. All it said is, everything is about what we want. So let's see how we could improve that. So it's important to not assume. What we saw on that last example was an author assuming that we, his audience, just got the point that he was trying to make and just perfectly understood the evidence he gave. And if we're honest, it didn't make that much sense. You may maybe have heard the saying about the word assume. What happens when you assume? Don't do that, right? So let's think about that same example we just looked at, that weak use of evidence, and look. Let's look at how we could do that in a more strong way. So let's look at this. A strong use of evidence, taking the same concept, would do this. Today, Americans are too self-centered. Even our families don't matter as much anymore as they once did. There's the claim. Other people and activities take precedence. There's a little addition to the claim. In fact, the evidence shows that most American families no longer eat together, preferring instead to eat on the go while rushing to the next appointment. From the same article by Gleich, right? Now, here's the commentary part. Here's where this person really makes their case with a lot of strength, okay? Sit down meals are a time to share and connect with others. However, that connection has become less valued as families begin to prize individual activities over shared time, promoting self centeredness over group identity. They did a great job of explaining how the evidence they gave from Gleich connects to their claim at the beginning of the paragraph. If you get a second, go ahead and pause or rewind this podcast and look at the two paragraphs and look at the difference between the two. I'm going to be looking in your writing for these kinds of paragraphs, and we'll work on building up to that. So hopefully you notice this. These are the two paragraphs side by side. We can clearly see that this one, there's not much to it. It's not doing a very good job of connecting with the audience. And this one is really helping us understand what the author is saying. It's really doing a better job of communicating. So using outside sources aren't the only ways of using evidence. In fact, one of the other types of essays that you're going to be writing on the AP test is called an argument essay. And it's very similar to the synthesis essay, except you do not have sources to get quotes from. All of the evidence has to come from you. So you might be wondering, well, how can I come up with evidence? What evidence do I have to prove my claims? Well, in something like an argument essay, you would use your personal experience and your observations as evidence. So, for instance, to use observations, things you've observed as evidence, you need to describe what you observed with lots of details so that your reader can picture it, right? So, if you're talking about a fundraiser you saw going on and how well that fundraiser worked, you'd want to really explain everything you saw. What tends to happen when people use observations and personal experience is they do that dirty thing. They assume that their audience knows about their observation or knows about their personal experience, when that is something that needs to be explained with a lot of detail. And we're going to practice doing that. To use personal experience as evidence, you need to tell the story. Another word for telling the story is telling an anecdote of what you experienced with detail. Write it in such a way that your audience experiences it with you. Your audience should feel like they are there, right? So when we go back to that example, in those paragraphs we just looked at, the strong paragraph and the weak paragraph, you could replace the sentence that was referencing something that Gleich wrote. You could replace that with a short description of a personal experience you had or an observation you had. And it would function much the same way in the paragraph, but you would still have to comment on it. You would still have to explain. When we actually take all of the claims that we make within an argument essay or synthesis essay and we build those claims into full paragraphs backed up with evidence and with the evidence commented on, you'll see that very quickly you can write a strong paper and actually a fairly lengthy paper just by building claims with lots of evidence. And there's no rule that says you just have to have one piece of evidence for each claim. In fact, it's awesome if you can have more evidence for each claim. Think about it as a court case. The more evidence you have, the stronger your claim is. I hope this lesson was helpful. If you have any questions about using evidence, about everything being an argument, please, either through email or talking to me in person, let's sit down and knock out any problems you have. So as we come to a close here, I want you to remember that everything is an argument and that every argument needs to be backed up with strong evidence.